There are some huge macro trends taking off right now that are pretty much breaking the stock market. So we're going to go over exactly what those trends are in this video so that you can protect yourself and make money off of them. Because if you don't follow these developments, then you're going to be missing out on profits that you could have had. So let's jump into it. We just released a new market note at MacroOps, which is our global macro research and consulting firm, and it's titled A Hungry World. And in this note, we talk about three big trends that are happening. The first is the consumption trend. So we have an equation right here. Population growth times income growth equals exponentially rising consumption curves. So from the 70s through 2000, we saw a relatively stable average of 700 million people enter the global middle class. And those same people cross the wealth S-curve tipping point. And this wealth S-curve tipping point is an important concept to understand what exactly a civilization goes through, or its people, its population. So what it basically means, which you can see in this graph right here, is after a country reaches a GDP per capita past a certain point, which is that 2300 to 3300 level, consumption takes off. Because again, this population growth times income growth, meaning once people have money, they really want to consume a lot more than they have before. And when we're talking about consumption, we're talking about agriculture, energy, products, everything. So in this example, we're looking at China, and they crossed this wealth S-curve tipping point in the early 2000s. And if you lay that same graph on a commodities graph, the price of commodities, you can see as soon as they passed that point, commodity prices took off because all of a sudden there was a ton more demand. And you know how big China is, so you know how big of an effect that had. You can see the same thing comparing China to India. You see India didn't really pass that S-curve tipping point yet, but they are on their way. And that's pretty much what we're talking about right now. We're currently on the cusp of seeing roughly 4 billion people enter the middle class, which means for the first time ever, a majority of the world's population will live in middle class or rich households. So even when we talk about the wealth gap and, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, on a global scale and on a historical scale, our people have never been richer than they have been now. And when I talk about our people, I mean like the human race. Every time you flush a toilet or turn on a light switch, you gotta realize no matter how poor you are, you're still doing way better than the richest kings way back in the day. They didn't have indoor plumbing or electricity. And even when you hear someone like Bill Gates talk about it, who really focuses on global poverty, he says they are making good headway. And once again, you could see that when you look at GDP per capita. So now a majority of the world's population will live in middle class or rich households. That's a huge change. And what that means is that we're gonna see an exponential rise in consumption across the board for all goods. And this translates into an incredible thirst for energy because it's an input into practically everything, right? Anything you want to consume pretty much had to be created with an energy expenditure. When we're talking about energy here, we're talking about coal, electricity, solar, all of that all together. So Bill Gates' favorite author and prolific writer, he's a super smart guy, his name is Victor Smil. He's written tons and tons of books, especially about energy. So he's saying that less than a sixth of all humanity right now is enjoying the benefits of a high energy civilization. And a third is now engaged in a frantic race to join that minority, and more than half the world's population has yet to begin the ascent. So if you think about who lives the best, it's the Western civilization, right? But most of the world has never caught up, so they haven't been able to consume like we do over here. So the potential need for more energy is enormous as all those people start crossing over and they start having money and want to increase their consumption. So the impossible option is to extend the benefits of 2 North American high energy societies to everyone else. This would require 5 times the current global supply. So we can't even meet the energy demand for the amount of people that are going to start needing it. See, all these people joining the middle class for the first time are going to want to consume the same things the rest of us in the West have long enjoyed. It makes sense, right? So as investors looking at this, we know this is a massive, massive trend that we want to be on the right side of. Bank of America predicts that primary energy demand is going to grow 40% by 2035. So in that scenario, they believe the world will need $48 to $53 trillion worth of energy investments over the same period just to keep up. Because again, the demand is growing so fast. So they estimate we'll see roughly $70 trillion in investments to facilitate a low carbon transition over the next 20 years. Because our government now is focused on the environment too, right? And all this energy consumption, that's a lot of pollution. So we're constantly trying to find those greener sources of energy. So 70 trillion in investments over the next 20 years. That's a lot. On top of that, a rising global income means a change in dietary habits. Wealthier societies consume more meat and dairy than lower income ones, which usually just consume grain. And the problem is that raising livestock is 7 times more grain intensive than producing for a simple plant-based diet. Meat is expensive in more ways than one, but all these people that are getting more money, they're going to want meat. So that change in dietary trend along with the growing global population means we'll see food demand increase anywhere between 59 to 98% by 2050. And that's a level of demand that our scientific community is skeptical that we'll even be able to meet. Can't meet the meat demand. So again, this is a huge trend, and there are ways to play it. Some of the companies we're invested in are BHP Group, ticker symbol BHP, Antero Resources, ticker symbol AR, Centrus Energy, which if you guys remember, I made a video about this. This is the nuclear energy, LEU, S&W Seed, SANW, Bioceres Crop Solutions, BioX. Made a video about that a few weeks ago and it popped hard. Then we got Cressy too. A lot of these stocks that we're invested in the macro ops portfolio, they are going to benefit off this huge trend. So it's definitely worth looking at energy-based and agricultural-based stocks. Now, along with all this, there is a second huge trend that's occurring right now too, and that's in the semiconductor space. You can see right here, we say that semiconductors are the new oil. And if you've been watching our videos, you know we've talked about this too, like with our Micron discussion. MU, it really took off since we first talked about it. See, there's a reason that the Taiwan Semiconductor, which are the biggest producers in the world of leading edge chips, they guided for 25 to 28 billion in capex spend for 2021. That's a 40% rise over the year prior. And that's because demand for these semiconductor chips are expected to balloon. High performance computing, which basically means AI, that's pretty much replacing smartphones as the critical driver for demand for these chips going forward. And normally the semiconductor industry is very cyclical, but because of AI, now it's becoming very stable because they constantly need more computing power. AI is all about how much data you can process. If you have more data and you could process more of it, your AI model is going to be better. And to do that, you need more and more storage and more chips. See, AI compute and training models are already doubling every 3 to 4 months, which is insane. Pretty much every business and every industry in the future is going to have to utilize some form of AI just to keep up. Big data and AI will pretty much be table stakes just to play the game. Here's just a few stats to show you how crazy this is going to get. 90% of the data available in the world today was generated in just the last 2 years. And it's expected to grow to 180 zettabytes, which is 21 zeros by 2025. So to put a zettabyte into context, storing just one requires 1,000 data centers, or about 20% of the land area of Manhattan. So this is an insane amount of data. A single autonomous vehicle will generate and consume 40 terabytes of data for every 8 hours of driving. And 1 million autonomous cars will generate as much data as 3 billion people. So these data needs are growing exponentially, which means the demand for semiconductors is growing like that too. This is why we've been talking about companies like Micron and Intel, and even Murata Manufacturing, which is a foreign stock. Semiconductors are a huge trend that we need to be looking at. Now, the third trend that we need to talk about is even more macro level, and it is really not a fun trend at all. And what I'm talking about here is war. So like we say here, conflict brings humility, humility produces comfort, and then comfort once again spawns conflict. So as we say here, conflict brings humility, humility produces comfort, and comfort spawns conflict once again. It's just a loop that goes on and on in history. French philosopher Blaise, I think, Pascal, he basically summed it up when he said all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And to sum this all up, basically, the more comfortable people get, the more they start looking for trouble. So you would think what we just talked about, a rising global middle class and technological creature comforts, would make us all happy. It would satiate our desires, but no, it does not. Here's an example of this tribe in Guinea. They are actually pretty well off considering, their standards. They are well fed and everything, but they still have war rituals. They're ceremonial, but they are deadly. They carry out attacks against their neighbors until they kill at least one man from the opposing tribe. They then go back and wait for a counterattack in which the opposing tribe will battle until one of their men is also killed. And none of these hill tribe people that we're talking about lack food or property. They live in relative abundance. So what happens is that because things are so good, the men are left with nothing to do other than to sharpen their spears and play out these deadly war games with fellow tribes. That's their answer to occupying idle time. It is messed up. But this doesn't just happen with tribes in New Guinea. We do the same thing in our modern world. It's just, more complicated. We have so many pointless wars, and we just play these ceremonial war games on a grander scale. So man's appetite for mischief and conflict is infinite if his time and energy are not preoccupied with other means. So right now, we're basically moving into a period that is ripe for greater conflict. And there's many different ways to look at why this happens. On this channel, we talk a lot about Bridgewater and Ray Dalio's debt cycles. And we talked about it before that we are at that point in the debt cycle where, a lot of war does happen. Think back, the last time we were at this point in the cycle was World War I and World War II. So think about something like that repeating. It's terrible, but it happens again and again throughout time. This always occurs. It's the same cycle over and over again. So as Alex says here, when human societies reach these historical forks in the road, the majority of people go one of two ways. One, they either become nihilists who peddle in conspiracy and actively promote anarchy through direct or indirect methods, like who they vote for. Or two, they just start relying on the state completely to help them with their ever-growing list of grievances, both real and imagined, basically creating a totalitarian government. So the first path leads to conflict through the intentional destruction of the existing power structures. And the second leads to eventual conflict because arrogant elites start pretending that they know exactly what to do when they really don't, and it causes problems. Now, of course, we don't know what exactly is going to happen, but it doesn't look good. So a wider dispersion of socioeconomic outcomes should be assumed with greater volatility than are normally expected. We got to prepare for larger tail events, both good and bad. So that's why in the macro ops portfolio, we're invested in companies like Ammo. If you remember, we did a video on this one. Ticker symbol POWW. Manolete Partners is another one, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, but ticker symbol MANO. And Altria Group, MO. Once again, these are all huge macro themes that you need to be aware of. They're going to be playing themselves out over the next few decades. But there's another large change that happened in the stock market recently that's going to affect us more over the short and medium term as well. And actually, technically the long term too. It is once again another secular change, just like the ones we've been talking about here, that you really need to know about. I made a video all about it right here. Once again, understanding this change is going to help you understand where the stock market is going over the next decade. So click this video right here and I will see you there.